Welcome to the Health Tech Crew podcast. I'm your host, Igor Gorlatov, proudly presenting Kepler Team. Today, we're thrilled to have Jennifer Bae, the Executive Director of Global Innovation for the American College of Cardiology, or ACC. Jennifer is a true polymath in healthcare. She's not just overseeing ACC's innovation program, she's also been on the board of startups that focus on improving patient care and clinician experience. With a background in venture capital, she's a firm believer that startups and VCs are the future of digitally transformed healthcare globally. Before her time at ACC, Jennifer was a global health warrior. She managed operations for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in Beijing, led biosecurity programs in South and Southeast Asia, and even contributed to the development of the global health security agenda at the U.S. Department of State. Oh, and did I mention she is multilingual, fluent in Spanish, Bahasa Indonesia, and Mandarin Chinese. We'll be diving into her unique insights on startup investments, her advice for healthcare innovators, and how AI is shaping the future of cardiology. You won't want to miss this. Hello, Jen. Thank you so much for joining me on the Health Tech Crew podcast.
Thank you for having me today, Igor.
So you've overseen the ACC Innovation Program. How do you envision venture capital and startup communities contributing to the digital transformation of healthcare?
I really love this question, and I really love what's behind it. I think that in order to answer it well, the first thing we have to do is describe what I mean by digital transformation. It's a term that's applied widely. You know, when our organization started our innovation program back in 2016, we had to confine the universe for what innovation meant to the practice of cardiovascular medicine. And within a year, we quickly aligned on what we call the digital transformation of care delivery, which essentially means technologies that are supportive of the provision of and access to care in communities where people live and work. So we're thinking a lot about things like virtual care platforms, remote patient monitoring platforms, and increasingly AI-enabled care embedded in those kinds of solutions that can do things like allow clinicians with less training to operate at the top of their license through supportive tech, but also allow us to do a better job of catching people who are living with a condition and route them for appropriate follow-up before they get too sick. When we think about venture capital's role in supporting that, obviously they are the funders, the early stage disruptive innovations that will be supportive of this overall transformation. And so they really have a very critical role to play. And it's an important part of my role in my organization to develop relationships with venture capital funds who are similar in their orientation so that we can share notes, so that they can learn from us about what cardiac clinicians and patients are looking for in technologies, and we can learn from them from the things that they're seeing in their deal flow. One of the things that I worry about a little bit in this space right now is the changing dynamic of funding. When we started this work in earnest in 2017, there was a huge spike in funding for digitally transformative technologies. And now that funding is waning a little bit. I won't use the word drying up, but waning. I think that, many VCs have funds. We know 2021 was a record-breaking year for building up funds, but expending those funds into these kinds of companies, I feel like folks are, there's a bit of a Darwinian pressure in some of these, this ecosystem. The idea that folks are waiting for companies to come online to make sure that they can be bootstrapping themselves in their own growth, that they have strong product market fit and business governance structures. But I hope that the venture community will still feed some of these entities because they do still need venture growth and venture supported growth to survive. One place that I think we're seeing a lot of interest right now is large language models, and I see that as kind of the next boom. So I think it's an incredibly important sort of back and forth that needs to happen here.
Just a quick follow-up on this. It looks like the healthcare system, at least in the US, is pretty monopolized, or there are a few big players. So if you want to innovate, you need to build relationships with those hospital systems and all those big organizations. So for startups and venture capital firms that support them, or even like angel investors who support them, there seems to be not a huge role to play other than play by the rules set up by these companies. So what are you seeing in practice allow startups to truly contribute to this digital transformation? Can their role kind of stay the same level, expand, or the trends are towards this bigger kind of ownership of the space so that only big boys with big money can win?
It's a great question. And I think if I've heard you properly, what you're really talking about, and again, let's just take the example of digital transformation of care delivery. A lot of the end purchasers of those technologies are ultimately hospitals and health systems. And a lot of those hospitals and health systems are already deeply engaged with what we would call large incumbent companies. So it's either the EMR system that they're operating on, or they have a relationship with Google or Microsoft or whomever. And I think it's really important for venture capital companies who are growing these types of solutions, and particularly these sort of pointed solutions that might be focused at a single disease case, use case like heart failure or something like that, to make sure that they're guiding those companies that they've funded to glom on to other larger platforms, because ultimately what the future state is that clinicians operating at these institutes really want a single UX UI, and so do patients. And so these smaller companies really need to be positioning themselves to be attractive to some sort of integration, because ultimately that's where the future needs to be. Physician burnout is so high, and the last thing we need is another dozen or 24 windows for these clinicians who are already strapped to be clicking through to be able to glean all the information in a single patient.
Very cool. You just validated the strategy of Kepler, which is to focus on helping organizations be integrated into all those EHR systems. So it's good
Glad
to
to hear that.
this is the path. So you've had a diverse career from global health to venture capital. Can you share some key milestones that shaped your journey?
It's really interesting because I think for me, what it ultimately boiled down to was not being afraid to try new things and following my curiosity and my interests. So I started out, like many young people, I think, in this country, really interested in science. I still love science. I still love reading science. And had initially thought that I was going to pursue a career in science, but found myself really drawn to wanting to learn business acumen and those kinds of things. And so I left the science field behind and pursued a degree in healthcare administration. Practiced as a consultant and learned a lot there, but found myself after doing consulting for a few years, living and working in Jakarta, Indonesia. And it was the scientific background that I'd had from years prior that opened up an entire career path for me that I didn't foresee for myself earlier on around, what it means to do public health, technical public health capacity building. In this case, I was working on laboratory biosafety and biosecurity. And it was because I found myself in the right place at the right time, and I knew how a biosafety cabinet worked. And so I was able to launch this wonderful career in public health capacity building and public health policy, which is a place that I still have a very deep and abiding love. Did that for about a decade. And when I moved back to the US permanently in 2016, I was able to find a role ultimately that I'm in right now that blends, the business acumen I got from, studying in business school type environments with a lot of the diplomatic skills that I had honed in 10 years in global health and global health security. And I think wedding those things together and thinking about the overall context with which people who align on shared goals sort of work towards allowed me to create a way of communicating that I think has helped me be a bit more effective. A good diplomat will come to a conversation prepared for what they want to achieve for their organizations or, in the case of diplomacy, their country's interests. But it's really important to listen first and identify those areas of common ground and then build out from there. And I think that orientation has really served me well professionally.
Very cool. You mentioned like diplomatic skills.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of negotiation. I was involved as an interpreter at negotiations that were happening in Ukraine. They were not successful, but just today I'm having a small negotiation workshop for local accelerator startups at RevTech Labs. So what advice would you give to startups building up their negotiation skills as they talk to investors, employees, stakeholders, potential pilot opportunities? Is there anything from your experience that could be applicable to them? And that will tell them today.
It's really interesting that you use the word negotiation, because one of the things that I have observed, and I'm trying to sort of mentally decide if I would call it negotiation. I think I would still, is sometimes what I see when we're approached by startups, that there's a sense that startup has gotten really good at delivering their pitch, and it's sort of a rinse and repeat, and that there's a failure to acknowledge the audience that you are pitching to and their expertise. And so it has happened many, many times that I've had a well-intentioned founder try to teach me cardiology when I work directly with cardiologists, and I actually know the space reasonably well. I don't need to know that heart failure is a problem. I understand that implicitly. We could skip past that part and you can jump into the places that, are actually meaningful for a shared conversation. I think if I were to offer you one piece of advice to give to that community, I would say, have them prepare for the conversation that they are going to have by studying the people who they're talking to first.
This is awesome advice. Thank you for sharing. So you had exposure to different cultures, but I know you're also multilingual. So how have your language skills played a role in your career, and especially in global health?
I think this is another example of, sort of looking back down the road and seeing connections where they might not be obvious. So in undergrad, I actually got a degree in anthropology, and I think I've always been fascinated by different cultures and different people. And I think language is a fantastic way of really understanding a culture. Different cultures express things differently, and that can play out in how individuals might understand a problem just because of the way that things are expressed. So I've studied languages where there's no verb conjugation, and to be able to understand whether something happened now or in the past or in the future, you have to modify it a little bit. And I think that has different notions about what the concept of time means. Or, when you use the same word for he and she, what does that mean for things like gender equality? Where you're not really bogged down on sort of feminizing or masculinizing, your language. Or when you are, what does that mean? And so I think what it does is it allows me, as you get better in a language, you start to be able to think in that language, and thinking in that language gives you a different way of sometimes considering issues and a different point of view. And I think it's that mental flexibility is the thing that I've really benefited from, beyond just the deep gratification I get from satisfying my own curiosity about people who live in other corners of the world and how they think and live and see the world.
So what languages do you speak, and which one was the hardest to master?
Oh, goodness. The toughest one was Mandarin, and I never learned how to read. So that's why I'm illiterate, but I could get around. If you dropped me into Beijing, I could probably still do what I needed to do, sort of business wise or anything like that. A little bit of small talk. But I think the other languages that I speak, I have some proficiency in Bahasa Indonesia, which is the language they speak in Indonesia, and I studied Spanish as an undergrad. And interestingly, that's the one that I haven't done living and working sort of necessity on. So I'm a little bit nervous about producing it. I have to practice.
Very cool. No, thank you so much for sharing. And I can relate to totally how a different language changes the way you think. Being from a Russian-speaking culture and coming to the US, there are certain adjustments you have to make. Just more specifically, the tone of formality. In Russian, there are like two, formal and informal. And in English, even though like we use the same words, kind of there is one U that you can use, not like two like in Russian, but the levels of formality are much more extended than in Russian. So I was really surprised, and there was a bit of learning for me to figure out what's the right way to address people. And I got feedback, Igor, especially like in software, your software is too informal with our mentors. You need to fix those emails. With ChatGPT and generative AI, it has become much easier for people, I assume, and for me, when it's not your native language, to find the exact words that you want to use.
I haven't used it yet for translation, but I can imagine that's true.
So let's come back to startups for a little bit. So you, in your current role, you're managing an investment fund. So what have been the most surprising learnings about working with startups in that capacity?
I tell my children a lot of times that the world needs all different kinds of people to function appropriately, that everybody has unique strengths and points of view, and that it's really important that people participate because, you know, when we have a breadth of sort of points of view represented, we end up with better solutions. I think that's true in the case of technology development as well. Early on, we met these genius founders. I mean, people who were involved in discovering the Higgs boson, things like that. You know, it's obviously these people are incredibly intelligent people and have been really thoughtful problem solvers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have all of the information or all of the insight to be able to build lasting solutions in the sphere of healthcare delivery. There really is an important role that clinicians and medical professional societies play into crafting solutions that are more fit for purpose than might be developed in a vacuum. And I think that that was one of the things that it took me about a year or two to really understand, and then another year or two to really sort of stand in that place and say to some, you know, sometimes to founders who may not realize that they don't know what they don't know, that they are missing key facets of a picture, and that it's really important that they understand them if they want to build lasting solutions.
So what could founders do who are listening to this podcast to be better? Should they reach to their local association, or like how can they find those unknown unknowns?
Yeah, I think an association is a great place to start. I think, you know, more and more associations are starting to get involved in this place. Everyone's got their own take on that, and that's a whole separate conversation that you and I could have. But I think it is a great place to start because alternatively, what they do is they will Google who is the expert on heart failure, and you get the same list of 5 leading names who truly are luminaries in their field, but they can't help everyone. They're often really busy people too. And so I think starting with an association gives a deeper bench of expertise and also a breadth of expertise that they might not know that they need.
So beyond engaging clinicians in building your startup, what specific advice would you give to innovators who are looking to specifically create an impact in the cardiology space?
This gets back to a bit of what we talked about earlier in our conversation, Igor. We were talking about, you know, the difference between cardiovascular specific innovations and innovations that could be relevant to multiple areas of medicine. And again, you know, this is going to be, my comments are largely informed by my personal focus, which is on the digital transformation of care delivery. Focusing in that way makes me agnostic, honestly, in a lot of ways. A technology that I engage with must be relevant for cardiovascular care, but the ones that we're most drawn to are also relevant to diabetes care, oncology care, mental health care, or any of the other sort of adjacent conditions that people living with heart disease are often also living with. And so, you know, if you're trying to solve the problem of how do we use technology to bring care closer to the communities where people live and work, that should be relevant for multiple fields of medicine. And that gets back then again to that point of if you have a point solution that's specific to one, you know, use case, you have uncovered an algorithm that is really predictive of heart failure decompensation, which is an area that a lot of companies have been interested in sort of in the past 5 years. Make sure that your algorithm is plugged into the bigger thing so that, you know, you now are part of a broader platform that's relevant to people with heart failure and diabetes and maybe a history of depression or whatever it is. And so, that would be my biggest piece of advice.
So do I understand correctly that it's more about integrating the outputs of your systems into the bigger picture so that like physicians could use your insights outside of the actual kind of narrow case that you're solving?
That's exactly right.
Okay. I'm glad I'm following where you are going with this. When we talked last time, you mentioned how exactly your investment process looks like. So you typically co-developing and you're bringing in those clinical experts to help build solutions that work for those experts. So talk a little bit about this process and how does funding from your organization or your network fit into this picture?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we've done it historically is that we haven't invested in companies where we haven't also been co-developing. And again, it gets back to those earlier phase discussions that we had had with the startup community, where we realized that there was a real need for these technologies in order for them to be successful, for them to have consideration of clinical workflow in the case of specific cardiovascular use cases. So it might be atrial fibrillation or an irregular heartbeat. It might be heart failure. It might be something else. But also consideration of, from both a patient and a clinician perspective, what does that interface look like? How are you getting information to clinicians? What is the frequency with which they want that information? What's actionable and knowledgeable, sort of triggering information, and what's just sort of nice to have information? And so when we think about technologies for co-development, we're really looking for, again, those companies that can scale and fit within the digital transformation of care delivery. So solutions that are applicable to cardiovascular medicine, but not just cardiovascular medicine. There was a point in time where we had done this basically as a triage model of, let's just look at the incoming because we had a tsunami of incoming and try and sift through that. And now what we're doing is we're really starting to call the ball for technologies that we're looking for. And I think in that respect, we're becoming a little bit closer to a traditional VC model, where although we're interested in broader things, remote patient monitoring and AI-enabled care, we're really looking for solutions right now that focus on how we can move the dial on administrative burden of clinicians, because we know that that is a massive problem. We also know that we have a shrinking healthcare workforce and a growing population of sick people. So we have to make the practice of medicine less burdensome than it is. And that's a really important member value that we provide as a medical professional society. We're also really interested in data-driven care management solutions as another specific area. And again, it's for that same reason. How can we figure out where to direct clinical attention is the problem that we are trying to solve with those kinds of solutions. And we think that there's a lot happening with AI-enabled care that will allow us to do a better job of that. Once a company enters our portfolio of co-development, then we're going to be thinking about potential investment. And at that point, we're really looking at, again, sort of alignment with our strategy and our mission, which is what would get you into the co-development pipeline, and ways in which we can contribute. So oftentimes when we're co-developing, we're contributing our guidelines and our brand to that. And then, has the solution, in many cases, if it's guiding clinical care, we have to think about FDA or CE mark. And then financial considerations that would be common to any other venture capital firm. So have they figured out product market fit? Have they figured out how to get their solution in front of the folks to shrink that sales cycle? Or are they planning, recognizing that it might have a long sales cycle, but they've got a plan to address it? But path to profitability, a financial plan, the team, product market fit, a lot of the things that I think most other investors would look for.
Is it okay if I ask you a few very specific point questions just to figure out the overall process from a startup perspective?
Sure.
From the point of view of the stage in the startup journey, what are the stages of companies you're most interested in?
I'm so glad you surfaced that because that was one of the things I forgot to cover. In our earliest days, we were investing in seed stage companies, and what we realized was that we wanted to pivot our strategy to be more mid stage companies because we're a little bit impatient, if I can be honest. We are eager to have solutions in the hands of clinicians and patients immediately. And so we really need to be working with companies that are already in that growth stage, already in market and starting to accelerate. And so we're really looking for, Series B to E companies now.
And in terms of this collaboration, unless this is like classified information, what is the typical check that you write? What's the typical kind of terms that you offer? Is it something that you can share?
It's a great question. And I think the way that I would answer that is we're not a lead investor. The value that we bring is that we're a strategic investor. We know that the organizations that want us as investors on their cap table see value with an affiliation with the American College of Cardiology, that they want to be able to say that the ACC has, believes in a technology like the one that they're producing. And it's important to note too that, we don't limit ourselves. So for example, we don't invest in just one remote patient monitoring technology. We invest in several because we believe in the ecosystem. For us to be able to affiliate and be able to put, our insight into the company, but it's really important and valuable to the company to have an affiliation with us. In terms of check sizes, we are modest. We're about 100 to 500K on average. But again, the value that we really bring is the strategic and the insight that we can provide in the relationship with the company.
And I have a kind of Kepler sponsored question because as a technology company, we're trying to figure out how can we partner with VC groups and VC firms on the technology side. Like we had a couple of exits where we worked with the founder, then they raised Series A, then they went to be Series B or acquired by private equity group. We had a couple of exits, and every time we have to compete with organizations that are brought in from like referral partners, VC groups. They have come with their own technology vendors, in particular around integrations, but also general support. So what are you seeing in organizations that you are investing in or in your portfolio? And do they come with this need for technical expertise, or do they have a technical team already that covers everything they may want to make this truly like scalable technology-wise?
We don't get it. If your question is about sort of software development and computer programming or any of those kinds of things, that is not our value add. And we trust the people that we work with have already built their own teams who are incredibly intelligent in this space. The lens that we will always provide, again, is that clinician and patient end user lens of, making sure that when those world-class programmers are programming, that they're programming towards building something that has a solid UX UI.
So you are looking essentially, what I'm hearing, you're looking primarily through the user experience.
That's right.
Okay. No, this is awesome. Thank you for sharing. So based on what you described, it looks like you moved away from earlier stage organizations. So there are no companies that are looking to do a pilot that could hope to engage with you as an investor. But is there other way to kind of get access to your guidelines, for example, or to start kind of figuring out the next phase of the journey before they become the Series B company?
Yeah, so we have a team that licenses our guidelines to entities that want to incorporate them. We know that that's really common. They're publicly available, but they are our IP, and so you really do need to have a license. For any listeners out there who have maybe licensed our guidelines, it's important that you have a relationship with us so that that's documented appropriately. Yeah. So, in our early days, we had experimented with that kind of a model. And here's where it gets really difficult. And it's a problem that I wish I could solve. It's a problem that I would love to be able to have a streamlined solution for. But for us as a medical professional society, you have to kind of think about the daisy chain of relationships. So we're here as a medical professional society. We have relationships with our members who are cardiologists at facilities all over the world. When you think about launching a technology solution at a healthcare system, for example, It's often the cardiologist might get a seat at the table for launching those solutions, but it's really the IT team that you need to have a connection with, which is not where I have linkages. And, you know, it just became really difficult for us, one, to obligate an organization that is not us to participate in a relationship with a third entity. And so that's really the problem. I've not discovered a way to be able to scale that in any sort of meaningful way. And so sometimes it happens in engagements, co-development engagements, where one of our member experts who might be involved in advising us in that journey is able to then participate and launch the technology at their facility. That's happened before, but there's no way for us to guarantee an entity that we could do that. And it wouldn't be appropriate for us to do that.
Sure. But I guess my kind of question and a little bit of an ask of a bigger association like yours, like how startup friendly are you? How friendly are you towards innovators to get started and get to the next level? Because this is the level, like everyone is interested in Series B companies. They get to be selective. This earlier stage innovators, they lack expertise, they lack access, and usually they don't need guarantees. They just need an opportunity to have a conversation.
Yeah, and I think I have to be really honest on that. So I think what seed to A company would get from my team is, one, we do want to know about those companies. There's only so many hours in the day, so we can take those calls sort of where we can fit them in. And so a deep sort of intense relationship is not what you're going to get from us. But it's important for us to know about those ideas early on, because we can offer a couple of things. One, if we think they're appropriate for a venture capital firm that we have a relationship with, we're happy to make those connections. Two, we want to watch these companies grow from seed and Series A stage so that when they get big enough, we can then participate when they're able to scale more. And three, sometimes we can give them something in passing that they might find useful. But again, that's sort of, it's not something, I'm not suggesting to your community of listeners that Jen Bae will be available to take a ton of Series Seed or Series A calls. We'll still be pretty selective about who we want to meet with. And generally it's because it's something novel that we haven't seen before. But we do on occasion talk to those early stage companies and provide that sort of light advice that I just listed.
And thank you. Thank you for your honesty and sharing where you actually are. There is one topic that is very popular, and we alluded to it a little bit. It's AI, in particular language models, also predictive care. This is the area I'm particularly curious about, where you kind of become almost a source of data for your provider, so that information through Apple Watches and other devices is collected on an ongoing basis. So how does technology and AI fit into your thinking about the evolution of healthcare and digital health?
Absolutely. So you're giving me the opportunity to shamelessly plug a paper that my colleague Amibot and I just published this week in Nature Digital Medicine on collaborative intelligence. So please do take a look at that. But ultimately, we define collaborative intelligence as the human AI interaction in the service of making the human better and more effective. And in this case, what we're talking about is human clinicians. And it is essential that the clinical community embrace AI in healthcare, because there are three things that are happening simultaneously. We have accelerating complexity and exponential information overload, for exactly the reason that you just pointed to, Igor. We have people that are able to monitor themselves on their Apple Watches. I have one as well, or their patch, or maybe they're doing some sort of patient-reported outcomes with their rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis, or whatever it is that they're dealing with. And so how do we come up with a way of assessing signal to noise on that terabytes and terabytes of data? It also creates an opportunity for us to transition to more of a continuous care model and optimize resource allocation. And what I mean by that is, again, viewing this from the lens of cardiology, we've historically said as a community, if we see patients, and I am not a clinician, but I'm speaking in the voice of one right now, once, maybe twice a year for the condition that they're living with, that's sort of standard of care, but these people are living with these conditions every day of the year. And so there's a lot that could be missed in those 6 and 12-month intervals. There's also a way for us to use technology that allows us to know when folks can stay home as much as it is when folks need to go in and see their clinicians, right? What we hear a lot from the heart failure community is those folks know that they are sick. They don't want to be thinking about it all the time. They're trying to think about, the life that they have to live. And so putting that in the background, if you have machines that are basically saying, Mr. Smith or Ms. Jones is stable, and so we don't need to adjust their medications or things like that, then maybe that means that they get to go on for a while, just sort of living their lives. And the folks who really are experiencing what they call that decompensation, now they're sleeping, sitting upright, and they're having trouble breathing, that those are the folks that really need to be seen. And we preserve that precious, increasingly limited clinic space for those people who need intervention. And then the last thing, and this is a really important one because a digital divide is real and exists. At the same time, we have a lot of assumptions about who has access to technology and what technology they have access to, but there needs to be a mandate in all of this to make sure that we are providing equitable access to quality care. And, the ACC is doing some really interesting work there. We have a health equity heat map that we've created where we're looking at, burden of disease overlaid with the legacy of historic redlining. I am personally involved with the American Telemedicine Association, and last week was the Telemedicine Awareness Week. They have their own heat map about broadband access. And I think there's places where you can bring those data sets together and really start to understand where are the communities of people who have disproportionate burden of disease, and do they have the ability to plug in with technology? It's really need to bring a lot of intentionality towards.
Yeah, I was looking, this is a wonderful perspective you're bringing. I was looking more from the perspective of not just this, like treating sick people, but also extending health and allowing people to
I'm
live
so glad
forever.
you steered me that way. So yes, because you had said predictive. I think there's a lot of work that's being done. We saw some really fascinating papers a few weeks ago presented at the European Society of Cardiology on algorithms that are sitting on top of EKGs, which, here in the US, it's a pretty ubiquitous test. It's not universally available everywhere in the world, but it's widely available here in the US, that are predicting onset of disease up to 5 years in advance. And not just cardiovascular disease, but also they're increasingly able to detect things like cirrhosis in advance. And so I think there are other technologies that are also fairly ubiquitous, technologies that are imaging the vessels in the eye. We're seeing a lot of really interesting work with cell phone cameras and hypertension, and being able to, if not directly measure blood pressure, correlate measurements, imputed measurements of blood pressure with people who either have high or low blood pressure. And I think that what we have to do then is build a healthcare system that can be responsive to those previously undetected needs. And I think that's another place where, especially in the near term, technology is going to play a role, because current state now is that we have too many sick people and not enough clinicians at various levels of training. There's also, we know, a lot of unmet demand. And so how do we build a healthcare system that can be responsive to that kind of preventative care, I think is a really important question for our community to contemplate, so that we can keep people out of the system and keep them living well. And thank you again, Igor, for steering me back in that direction.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing those examples. Those are really awesome. So if you could travel back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self just starting out in the space of healthcare?
That's such a great question. I think what I would do is, in some ways, I would allow myself, again, a bit more freedom to follow my curiosity and worry less about stacking myself against sort of other people and where they came from academically or their growth trajectories. Because once I embarked on this road of having to reinvent myself just by virtue of moving around a bit globally and those kinds of things, And following my curiosity, I found that the professional growth and the satisfaction really came along with that. And now, being at a stage where I'm 20 plus years into my career and looking back, I can realize that these seemingly disconnected sets of experiences have really served me well in creating sort of a different point of view that's informed by a lot of different experiences and allows me to add a unique value to the organization I lead and the conversations that I'm in. And I'm not sure that I would have had that had I been afraid to try new things that hadn't occurred to me before.
So are you saying that just being open to experiences versus trying to measure yourself against others?
I think it's a bit of both of those things, if I'm being honest. One of the other things that I hear in fits and spurts from, colleagues, friends, and family that are in their 20s is I think that there's this sense, and this is a much longer conversation we could have, that folks have to know exactly what they're going to be when they grow up, when they're 21 or even 18 and applying to college, and rigorously follow this narrowly defined path. And I think one of the great blessings in my professional career over the past 20 years is that I'm in a job that didn't exist when I graduated from college. And so allowing yourself to, follow those threads and those changes, because I think the other thing that's true right now is we are in a very dynamic period of our development as a society. I think it's a fantastically, fascinating time to be alive, that if folks are too rigid in how they think about their career development, they could miss out on being able to contribute to some really transformational things.
Very cool. I love that perspective. My last question for you is, what's the next big thing that you're most excited about in the near future, for example, in the next 6 to 12 months?
6 to 12 months is hard because I think the 6 to 12 month horizon and the things that I'm most interested in are the same kinds of things that we talked about just a moment ago, which are some of these predictive analytics and how we can be doing more well care. But the corollary to that as well is with a lot of these signals where I foresee to use the Gretzky analogy, where the puck is headed. I think that we are going to migrate from sort of logistic regression, mathematical model-based assessments of whether someone is in or out of healthy or unhealthy, normal or abnormal bounds based on, a universal normal to more of a personal normal. I think the cancer community is already there largely with, genomic data. I think when it comes to other areas of medicine like cardiology, I think genomic data is an important part of that. I also personally have a little bit of bias against genetic predeterminism, but I think there's a lot of really interesting signals that the body gives off, whether it's a unique EKG wave or an individual's sort of resting heart rate or their particular normal blood pressure, which might be different, you to me, for example, as two different individuals. And it's the deviation from that individual norm that I think is going to be where medicine is headed. And those early signals that will allow us to act earlier on an individual level to retain their health and well-being versus treating them when they are sick. And so whether that happens, I think the technologies are online and available in the next 6 to 12 months. I think that the hurdle to be surmounted is how do we create a system where those things can be adopted? And some of that's going to be evidence-based, and that takes time. And some of that's going to be change management sort of questions in terms of how we think about healthcare and the delivery of healthcare.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen, for this wonderful conversation.
It was a pleasure, Igor. Thank you so much for having me.
Wraps up another insightful episode of the Health Tech Crew podcast. A huge thank you to Jen Bae for sharing her invaluable perspectives on venture capital, digital transformation in healthcare, and so much more. Jen, your insights are a treasure trove for anyone looking to make waves in the healthcare industry. I also want to extend my gratitude to all of you, our listeners, for tuning in. Your engagement is what makes this platform a hub for innovation and discussion. Last but certainly not least, a big shout out to the Kepler team for making this episode possible. If you are in the health tech space and need a wizard with EHR integrations, look no further than Kapler. They are the backstage tech heroes that bring episodes like this one to life. So, until the next time, keep innovating, keep listening, and let's continue to push the boundaries of what's possible in healthcare. See you in the next episode.